Hello, and welcome to the first part of a two-part webinar on ensuring student leadership has impact in your setting. The first part will be a look through some of the history and some of the current research on student leadership and a brief summary of some of the things that it will be worthwhile thinking about before you join the live webinar next week. So before I begin, let me say a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. Kevin Bartle. I'm Senior Education Lead at SSAT, and I thought it would be interesting to share with you my background linked to my interest in student leadership. So I began as a teacher in 1995, and in 2005 I was promoted to assistant head teacher, and I was given the responsibility for student leadership and voice, which I developed into a full and wide-ranging offer that we called the Student Parliament. In 2014, I became a head teacher, and the school that I led had a very vibrant and very wide-ranging student government. In 2021, I completed my studies for a Doctor of Management, which I mentioned just to kind of keep that thread of being interested in leadership. And in 2023, I became Senior Education Lead at SSAT. And since December of 24, I became responsible for our delivery of Student Leadership for Impact. And our work has been ongoing for many, many decades now. Actually, when I was assistant head teacher, it was SSAT who we called upon to do some training with our student leaders. But now I'm at the other side, I wanted to have a look again at the research and what it was telling us, and I'll explain why shortly. But this is a quick overview of our model. We have always talked about student leadership for impact, but drawing down from the research base, we've tried to do some more incisive work on thinking about what we mean by impact, so that we can support you as the adults who are leading student leaders and support the student leaders themselves. I'll come back to that and say a bit more. But let me begin with one of two bookends, why student leadership matters. And it's this quote from Donna Mitra, who was quite a powerful voice in student leadership in the mid-2000s. And she said, the greater the involvement of youth in student voice initiatives, and the more that young people have the opportunity to assume leadership roles in these activities, the greater the rewards in terms of their development and their overall growth. And I'll come over the course of this session to explain a little bit more about how that works and why it's so important. Let me start all the way back by saying something that may surprise some of you, which is that student leadership has a really clear historic link to the civil rights movement. The reason for that is the work of someone called Sherry Arnstein in 1969, who devised something called the ladder of citizen participation, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, Sherry Arnstein was an advisor to two US governments, two Democratic US governments, under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s. And she was a famous, across America, civil equality advocate. And her notion of a ladder of citizen participation was explicitly about the redistribution of power, about increasing levels of influence of citizens, and with a focus upon moving up the ladder from where she perceived was a lack of representation to where she felt was citizen control. The reason why I mention that, against the backdrop of talking about student leadership, is because probably one of the most influential pieces of writing on student leadership was Roger Hart's work of 1992, in which he took Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which was aimed at adults, and thought about how that would look in schools and other organisations that work with young people. And you can see there, and actually what you might be able to see at the bottom of that image, is an explicit reference to the link to Arnstein's work. And I would say that this idea of student leadership, based upon the ladder of citizen participation, dominated the student leadership research landscape for a decade, perhaps a decade and a half. But interestingly, Roger Hart himself wrote a piece which was entitled Stepping Back from the Ladder. And there were some things that he said weren't quite right about his analysis originally. One, he said that there was a lack of focus on everyday and informal participation, and that's something I want to come back to soon. Too much emphasis on how adults engage with young people, a suggestion that the ladder makes that the things at the top are important and the things lower down are not important. And fundamentally, a bit of an overemphasis on children's power when in most education settings, children have a limited, necessarily limited relationship with power. But one of the things that Hart concluded in that piece was that he saw the ladder lying in the long grass of an orchard at the end of the season. And so I got myself to wondering, well, why might Hart be saying that? And I think probably the most important reason was this. This is the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which was ratified in 1989 and then ratified by the British, or the UK government rather, in 1991. And in particular, these two, Articles 12 and 13, about respect for children's views and the ability for children to share their thoughts freely. So as I said, Arnstein's work through Hart dominated quite a significant proportion of the thinking about student leadership in schools for 10 years or maybe 15 years after 1992. So when I took over responsibility for student leadership for SSAT, the first thing I decided to do was to have a look at recent student leadership research. I'm going to share with you a bibliography of some of the most influential pieces that were in this, so that at some point you can pause and have a look and see if you want to find out more. This is from Black et al. Through to Hay and Dempster. And the second page from Hill to Wright et al. And again, I'll pause that and you can pause it if you want to have a look. It's also on a blog post on SSAT's website about the research behind our student leadership for impact work. But let me, in this session, think about, well, what are the key lessons that we can take from research? And there are three in particular that I want to focus on as preparation for what we're going to look at next week's live webinar. So the first lesson from recent research is this, that students' views of leadership are highly democratic. They're non-hierarchical, they're focused on the social returns that can be got from leading, and they're based on relational and team-oriented competencies. And I'll break that down a little bit for you, showing you where some of those findings have come from. So first of all, what are students interested in about leadership? So Mitra said that they're interested in influencing issues that matter to them. Frost and Roberts say that they're interested in the idea of leadership as a social process rather than leaders as hierarchical entities. That they're interested, according to Bowman, on influence rather than control. They want to make a difference, but they want other people to work with them to make a difference. That they're interested in democracy in its widest sense. In other words, this idea that everybody can participate in some way, shape or form. That they're interested, according to Bowers et al., in team-oriented rather than individualistic competencies. Dempster says that they're interested in relationships rather than hierarchies, again, reminding some of the things that were earlier. And that they're interested in social returns, particularly around tackling inequality, than about what they can get out of being a leader as they move into adulthood. But probably my favourite piece of research about what students value in leadership is from Wright et al., who surveyed 7,000 students to identify what they valued in terms of leadership skills and attitudes. And it might be worth, at this point, just pausing and thinking, well, what would be in the top 5 or the top 10 would you assume on the basis of a survey of 7,000 students? But this is what they came up with in order. Firstly, confidence. Secondly, communication skills. Then honesty, responsibility, and listening. And then 6 out of 10, the rest of the top 10, they talked about the importance of respectfulness, integrity, empathy, being a team player, and compassion. And I think it's worth taking all of those together in the round to just see how they back up that previous slide, talking about the importance of democracy in its widest sense, of the social returns, of leadership rather than leaders. And so there's something inherently important to students and young people about human values, and particularly human values enacted socially, that we need to keep in mind whenever we're thinking about what student leadership opportunities we offer and help them to take. So just as a reflection point, something for you to pause and think about that will help you when we look at this next week. Do you know what your students value about leadership? So the example I've just given you was based upon international schools, quite high status young people. But what about in your context? Do you know what your students value about leadership? Because that might be an important stepping stone to building student leadership structures for them. And of course, these things can be easily found out these days with online returns through surveys and other kinds of ways of finding out from students what they value. And the second reflection point, how far does what you ask student leaders to do in your school reflect their interests rather than the interests of the school? Hopefully they'll be aligned, and one of the key elements, one of the key strands of our Leadership for Impact is alignment with school values. But how much does student leadership work at your school reflect the interests of the students themselves? So lesson 2 from the recent research into student leadership says this: student leadership development is age related, but it is not age constrained. And I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. It involves incremental development of capabilities, and it operates in a variety of different spaces. So let me again break that down to you based upon what the research says. So first of all, this idea that student leadership is age related and incremental. So Wang says that the secondary years are key for student leadership development. Good preparation for it can be done in the primary years, but actually where they are in secondary years is unimportant. So you can have year 6, year 5, year 6, year 7 students taking on quite significant roles that currently might be put aside for year 11, 12, 13 students. And they will be able to take them up if they are supported to do so. Caragiani and Montgomery also say that adolescence is an important time for leadership growth. But as a counter to that, Coffey and Lavery talk about the middle years being limited for high-level student leadership opportunities of a formal nature. That quite often, and we see this time and again in schools, head students are appointed in year 11 or in year 13, depending upon the age range of the students at the school. And so that students slightly younger than that find it difficult to take up those opportunities because they are not accessible to them under the way schools have them organised. And then in terms of incremental development, Mitra talks about 3 different stages of student leadership development. The first one is that they are heard. So the importance of student voice as a baseline for any student leadership work. Then have the operation to collaborate with adults. And through that learning with adults, having been heard, that they then are able to build their leadership capacity. Coffey and Lavery and Frost and Roberts talk about some things that are quite similar. The first say that schools scaffold skills development through a continuum of opportunities. So obviously these are effective student leadership organisations where they think about how the skills are scaffolded, almost, if you like, as a curriculum. And Frost and Roberts go a little bit further than that, saying that schools should prioritise the teaching of participation and actually make it an enacted curriculum in some way, shape or form. Freeborn talks about how actually our schools' curriculums are ideal for teaching key leadership skills because they're rooted in things like critical thinking and reasoning. And Hay and Dempster talk about how they should be embedded in lessons rather than seen as a bolt-on through extracurricular provision. And Lyons et al. Talk about it is important for the direct instruction. What we ask leaders to do needs to be taught in the same way as we would with, for example, somebody taking on a middle leadership position in schools. And then this notion of the different spaces in which student leadership can take place. So first of all, a couple of writers talking about the importance of physical spaces, classroom, extracurricular provision, the local community and the international community. And what's interesting about the work that I've done with student leadership in the past is that quite often schools are geared up for the extracurricular provision element of that. And student leadership as a classroom entitlement and a classroom obligation for adults working with children in classrooms is not there, even though it is in the classroom where students spend the bulk of their time. Lyons et al. Talk about the importance of relational spaces, that students need to develop personal leadership. They need to be able to manage their own conduct and practice and taught how to do so. Then they need to be able to take that into an interpersonal dimension, again, need to be taught and equipped with how to do so before moving on incrementally into organisational space and the formal student leadership opportunities that they gain because they can manage themselves and because they can manage and lead with others. And then finally, Coffey and Lavery talk about status spaces. Schools quite often are filled with formal school-sanctioned opportunities for students, so form representatives, head boy or head girl, head student, leaders of certain groups within the school, which are formally created, formally elected, formally celebrated. But there's also a significant amount of informal student leadership going on. And what's quite interesting, according to Coffey and Lavery, is how often those informal leadership spaces, so leading within a sports team, for example, or leading within an art exhibition or production, that those informal spaces are often carved out by the kinds of students who come from underrepresented groups in formal spaces. And one group in particular, boys, the research indicates that boys tend to take up formal opportunities less often and are less often sustained in those formal leadership opportunities, but might quite often thrive in some of the informal leadership spaces. And again, some reflections for you to think about ahead of the session next week. Does student leadership development happen in your classrooms? Is it rooted, as well as the formal curriculum, is it rooted in classrooms so that students know what they're working towards and then can take up the formal opportunities when they present themselves? And then what about the formal leadership roles that you have at your school? Do you know which groups are less likely to take up those roles? Which groups are more likely to take up those roles, and where that leadership capacity goes to if it's not occupying formal leadership roles at your school? The third and final lesson that I want to bring about from recent research is that school support for ensuring that students encounter leadership opportunities in daily practice must be driven by ethos, systems, relationships, and highly engaged leaders. And I'll break those down further for you. So in terms of ethos and norms, Wright et al. Talk about there needs to be, for effective student leadership to happen, a pervading ethos across the school that students can lead and they can be taught how to do so. And when they talk about pervading ethos, they mean all adults in the school have a belief that that can happen. Lyons et al. Talk about the importance of governance that involves students. So not just thinking about the presentation of formal opportunities, but also thinking about how students are engaged in the control and the leadership of those leadership opportunities. And that could be by things such as a written constitution. And that's something that I did at my first school when I took on student leadership work. Or having an advisory board that has a remit for working with adults in thinking about how the school should be led and governed. And then Frost and Roberts talk about the necessity and the importance of having a clarity about what the purpose of student leadership activities is and what the scope is of student leadership activities. An example, I visited a school recently with an amazing offer for student leaders, but it was very, very clear where they didn't have authority and didn't have control, particularly around the issue of school uniform. And when I spoke to student leaders, they were perfectly happy with that because they realised that where they did have scope and where they did have purpose, it was genuine, it was meant, and they were happy to support the fact that in some matters, it was not they who were making the key decisions. And then relationships and alignment. Schools are littered with values these days on school websites, usually on posters in classrooms around the corridors. And Mitra talks about the importance of conscientious, continuous patterns of interaction that are aligned with those espoused values. And the importance of that, I think, is shown by this quote from Black et al., talking about young people who are highly idealistic about the democratic approach that they want for student leadership become very cynical when that rhetoric of democracy in practice is not fulfilled. So the importance of alignment with schools' values and that roots all the way through the organisation is really quite clear. And then the importance of everyday practices. Shire in 2001, one of the earliest pieces of research that I've brought through for this, talks about 3 O's, that there has to be openings so that students are ready to take up formal roles. There have to be opportunities provided, and the opportunities are more than just the openings because they are resourced and there is a knowledge base behind them that they are equipped with. And then finally, obligations. This idea that there is an enshrined commitment on the part of the school to building student leadership and giving it its headroom where it needs it and its scope to influence things. And Hill, who is one of the most recent pieces from this research and who is a school leader in the UK, talks about the importance of having a dialogic approach between adult leaders and student leaders, acknowledging the difference of power between students and adults, and including them, but without being tokenistic about it, making sure that where they don't have influence and don't have control, that that's clearly marked for them, but where they do have it, that they have it. And then finally, the importance of highly engaged leaders. Two things really. First of all, the absolute importance of the head. The head's role in championing, in facilitating, and in recognising student leadership cannot be overestimated. But interestingly, for people in your position who lead the student leadership work in the school, belief and recognition from you is almost as important as belief and recognition from the head teacher. You are the 2 most important people in the school. But it is also important that students don't hear one thing from the head and the person leading on student leadership and then see something different in the classroom. So it is important that classrooms are places where student needs and aspirations are expressed and considered, and where they don't have control, just like at a whole school level, informal student leadership opportunities, that's clearly marked out for them. And Black et al. Talk about the importance of CPDL for all staff and the importance of evaluating existing student leadership structures and processes. And I think that's quite interesting. I can't imagine most schools have CPDL time most years for student leadership. So how are those opportunities built in? And so another set of reflection points here. Are your school's stated values, the ones that are on your website, are they used to shape your student leadership offer? And are they therefore used to evaluate the impact of your student leadership offer? And another one, how visible are you and how visible is your head teacher in promoting and recognising student leaders? Because it's always good to pass across responsibility to other people, but the research tells us quite clearly that the students who you are supporting in their student leadership work will be looking to you and to the head teacher for that value and that validation. And then finally, as well as looking at the research about student leadership, I had a look at other models for student leadership. And I think what we've brought together in our student leadership for impact model is something that takes the aspirational qualities of some models, the very practical and down-to-earth approaches from other models, and some organisational elements from other models. And probably most importantly, it does it within the context of the English school system. So if you look around for student leadership models, you'll see Kouzos and Barry's Student Leadership Practices Inventory. And I think this is highly aspirational. It's very much focused on inspiring and enabling and encouraging, and is wonderful. And we brought elements of that into our model. Hay and Dempster, writing from an academic standpoint, pull down some very, very practical skills that student leaders should have in order to facilitate their work. And again, we've brought those into our model. C. Miller, I think, and again, this is another American inventory system for student leadership. And you can see there, for example, communication, civic responsibility sitting side by side. So it's a kind of blend of this highly aspirational with a highly pragmatic model. If you're looking outside of the education domain, Wu et al.'s work is about youth-adult partnership in healthcare, and offers some really interesting threads to follow for those of us who are in education. And again, we pulled those through into our model. And Lyons, Brassoff and Barron's try to pull all of that together and do so, I think, really well. Again, in an academic paper, thinking about how the different components of student leadership might function together. Which I guess brings us back to the starting point and what we'll talk about at the webinar next week. So our model is trying to pull all of those different strands from the models that were out there already, but also from the research evidence recently. So we focus on 6 key strands for impact, that students have the chance to have an impact. They are able to set goals, achieve success, and enhancing equality within their organisations. That it's modelled, that students know how to and are taught how to lead by example, how to take responsibility and how to show independence. That they are professional, that they know how to work well with others, to see different perspectives and to bring from those different perspectives good decision making that balances the needs of all with the needs of all, if you like. That they are aligned, to school values that are shared, that they contribute to upholding standards and strengthening teamwork in its narrowest sense within their student leadership work, but in its broadest sense across the school, across their local community. The focus on contextuality. This is the bit that's really, really important to students, making a difference to their community by responding to needs and solving problems. And the last bit, the thoughtful one, really encompasses 2 things. One is the ethical dimensions of being a leader. Are you thoughtful towards others? And 2, the thoughtful element as in academically and intellectually robust. So it involves equipping students to appreciate others and their views and their thoughts, and how to manage feedback effectively, and how to think reflectively about their work. So one final reflection point, thinking back to those, which of the impact strands are most successful at your school? Many schools are very strong, for example, on alignment. Other schools are very, very strong on professional qualities of students. But it's worth thinking which of these strands do you see as being areas where you have less journey to make and more progress already achieved. And of course, the other side of that, which of these impact strands will most require focus for your school? And I guess that's the why of why you are here, why you're interested in learning more about student leadership for impact. So some key learning points from this seminar as we start to bring it to a conclusion. Student leadership has a rich history. It goes back over half a century now, and it is, for better and for worse, intimately connected with civil and human rights. That from the research, we know that students take a very democratic view of leadership as a process of influencing change. And as part of that they highly value the social dimensions of leadership, more interested in that than in positional authority. We also know that student leadership takes place incrementally over time, that students develop it bit by bit, and they do so especially when it is effectively taught. And that student leadership development takes place in a variety of different settings, from the classroom to the extracurricular to beyond the curriculum, beyond the school, through personal spaces, interpersonal spaces, and social spaces, and organisational spaces. And also that it can be both formal and informal. And one of the jobs of somebody like yourself is how do you capture the informal as well as you capture the formal. And then the third lesson from the research, that student leadership thrives where the school's ethos and the relationships align well. And because of that, it is very dependent upon everyday practices, not just the one-off scenarios that happen once a month or once a fortnight, but what happens in every classroom. And it's particularly dependent upon highly engaged adults, not least of all you and your head teacher. And then, according to our model and our belief, that thinking about impact, thinking about modelling, professionalism, alignment, contextuality, and thoughtfulness are crucial to understanding and improving the effectiveness of student leadership in your setting. So what can you expect from the live seminar when it takes place? In terms of content, we're going to be looking at your starting point for student leadership. What is it that you want to do better, different, more? Thinking about the leadership of your student leaders, your role, your head's role, but also staff more generally and their role. How your organisation can most effectively support student leadership to be effective. And how you can align what it is your school wants to do with the structure of student leadership opportunities in school. And importantly, recognition processes. And concluding the session next week to think about what your next steps will be for student leadership. In terms of the process next week, we'll be strengthening the connections with the evidence base that I've talked about in this session. We'll be using examples and case studies to illustrate key points and to get you thinking about what that might look like in your school. Of course, we'll be asking you to reflect on your practice, and we'll be using some of our materials for self-evaluation to help you with that. And to evaluate what the impact is of your work, and thinking about that particularly in terms of those 6 key concepts in our student leadership for impact model. We'll be inviting you to share your ideas together for action planning. And probably most important for me to mention is that this will be a participative webinar. So we'll be asking for screens on and microphones on. We may well be using breakout rooms to help you hear more and talk more with others about what you're doing, so that you can share your good practice and learn from areas where your practice is less good, but other people on the call have something to offer you. All of this will be set against the backdrop of our wider offer around student leadership. So we'll pull together some strands from our student recognition scheme and our school recognition scheme to help you think about your work. And I started with a bookend, so I'll finish with a bookend about why student leadership matters, and particularly why your role in building student leadership matters. And it comes from Coffey and Lavery's report in 2023, and they say that the importance of adult support for student leadership cannot be overestimated, which is why I'm looking forward to meeting and talking with you next week and to helping you to shape your provision for student leaders. As a reminder, then, next week's session will take place on Thursday, the 25th of September, and it will start at 3:30 and continue till 5:30. And with that, I wish you farewell for now, and I look forward to seeing you then.